My name is Michelle DeLeon. I serve as the Director of Impact and Strategic Partnerships at SkyTruth. Thanks so much for joining me today. This event at Our Ocean Panama, hosted by SkyTruth, Stockholm Environment Institute, and the Center for International Environmental Law, or CIEL. Today we'll present novel tools and data sets to increase understanding of the risks that oil and gas activities pose to our ocean and our climate. So next slide, Joel. And today I'm joined by two panelists. Maxwell Dorman is the project manager of the Stockholm Environment Institute's Fossil Fuel Atlas. And I'm also joined by Upasana Khatri, who serves as senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law. Like I said, Max and Upasana were not able to join us today in person in Panama, so they are joining us virtually with some recorded presentations. And at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes, probably less, given the timing we have here, to respond to questions and answers from folks in the room. And folks online can also ask questions via the Q&A. And so today I'll be speaking to you about how we're using satellite data and AI to detect marine oil pollution. If you could click the next slide, please. SkyTruth is a conservation technology nonprofit founded over 20 years ago. We provide free fact-based information to expose environmental impacts of human activity. Next slide. Using satellite imagery and advanced data analysis techniques, we're able to reveal environmentally damaging actions and making their impacts visible, measurable, and actionable. Our work spans different geographies from mountaintop mining to deforestation in the Amazon. We're able to apply this technology to a wide range of issues. Next slide, please. In 2016, at Our Ocean 2016, SkyTruth launched Global Fishing Watch in partnership with Google and Oceania. And this provides the first global view of commercial fishing activities. Through Global Fishing Watch, we've shown that we now have the opportunity to exponentially increase our oversight of our vast ocean using emerging technologies like satellites and machine learning. This is especially important because ocean industrial activities are expected to double by 2030. And today we're going to focus on two of the other most economically significant ocean industries besides fishing. And that's the oil and gas industry and global shipping. Next slide, please. On any given day, there are about 50,000 large commercial shipping vessels traversing our vast ocean, responsible for transporting about 80% of global trade. Our ocean essentially serves as a vast superhighway. Next slide, please. And the oil and gas sector is the largest ocean-based industry, accounting for about a third of the total value of the ocean economy. And trends suggest that offshore oil and gas production is increasingly venturing into deep water and ultra deep water sectors. Next slide, please. Each oil platform is consequential. There's about 8,000 oil platforms across the ocean, and each one of these platforms consists of a hub of activity with many different types of impacts on our ocean and our climate. One of those impacts is marine oil pollution. Throughout SkyTruth's history, we've used remote sensing technology to detect the impacts of offshore oil production and shipping. Next slide, please. For example, during the Deepwater Horizon disaster, SkyTruth's analysts showed that the oil spills from the Deepwater Horizon disaster was vastly larger than what BP and the Coast Guard had claimed. Now, what if we could detect not just one major instance of marine oil pollution, and instead create a global map of chronic oil pollution in near real time? Next slide, please. So today I'd like to introduce Cerulean, which is our effort to track Cerulean, once launched, will be a free and publicly available platform that will reveal hidden industrial pollution events using satellite data and artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. So how does it work? At the heart of Cerulean is a machine learning model that combs through thousands of radar satellite imagery from the European Space Agency. We're using radar imagery, which can see through clouds and is sensitive to oil on the surface of the ocean. And using machine learning, we're able to automate the detection of oil slicks around the world, created by offshore oil platforms and vessels, often tankers that are carrying oil. In this slide, we're looking at a typical oil slick detected by Cerulean. It forms a dark streak on the ocean surface that appears strikingly artificial. In this case, we're looking at an 80-mile-long oil slick wrapping the coast of Indonesia. The vessel responsible for this pollution is visible as a very bright spot at the north end of the slick. By analyzing vessel tracking data, we're also able to identify the potential source of this oil pollution. Next slide, please. In this case, it's a crude oil tanker owned by the state oil company. Next slide, please. Globally, we are also able to identify hotspots of oil pollution using Cerulean. The Cerulean model has been running since August 2020, and we've processed about 500,000 satellite images and detected more than 1,000 slicks from vessels and offshore oil platforms. And these hotspots range from the North Sea to the west coast of Africa and South America to the Persian Gulf. Next slide, please. So this example here shows a pair of oil slicks from oil platforms from the coast of Nigeria. SkyTruth, in partnership with Global Fishing Watch, is creating a global data set of fixed offshore infrastructure. And these are mostly oil platforms and wind turbines. Through that data set, we're able to pinpoint the specific oil platforms that are emanating chronic sources of chronic oil pollution. The red triangles that you can see on your screen show an early version of this offshore data set. Next slide, please. And discoveries from Cerulean will also allow users to illustrate and measure the cumulative footprint of offshore facilities around the world. In this case, we're looking at 4 platforms off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. Our pilot study suggests that these facilities cumulatively discharge about 200,000 gallons of oil into the ocean every year. Next slide, please. But we're not just stopping with oil pollution. Our vision for Cerulean is to create a full picture of the impacts of offshore oil production and global shipping by overlaying different data sets. And these include natural gas flaring, methane leaks, vessel traffic to service offshore infrastructure, as well as seismic survey activity. Next slide, please. In 2023, once we launched a publicly accessible platforms for Cerulean, anyone can zoom into specific incidents detected by Cerulean and investigate further. Here you're looking at an initial version of the user interface. Next slide, please. Of course, we're not going to be able to do this alone. Our impact really depends on partnerships with stakeholders around the world. Over the past 3 years, we've had the opportunity to do a lot of consultations with government agencies, advocates, journalists, and our hope is that by providing this data publicly available and by providing technical assistance to different stakeholders around the world, we're able to investigate this problem more closely and address it. Next slide, please. So here's an example case study of how Cerulean is already being used for impact. In 2022, we worked with journalists in the European Union who investigated the chronic oil pollution incidents that are happening currently in European Union waters and really investigating the effectiveness of government programs that should be mitigating these problems. Next slide, please. And like I mentioned, we're currently working with stakeholders around the world and providing technical assistance, and we'll continue to do that before the launch of Cerulean. So we encourage stakeholders who are watching today to get in touch with us. We're doing some bespoke analysis, regional analysis in Indonesia, the UK, and other regions that have hotspots of oil pollution, and really ensuring that this data set is going to the key stakeholders that will inform policymaking. And later this year, we'll be launching a public mapping platform for Cerulean. And in this around summer of 2023, we'll also be doing a beta testing for Cerulean. So my name is Michel Dalian. Like I said, I serve as Director of Impact and Strategic Partnerships at SkyTruth. Partnerships are really critical for our work here, so I'm really proud to share this event with Stockholm Environment Institute and CIEL. Marine oil pollution is really just the tip of the iceberg of the impact of offshore oil and gas platforms, as well as global shipping. There are many other impacts that Stockholm Environment Institute and CIEL will also talk about today. So I'll hand it off to SEI. We have a recording from SEI that we'll go ahead and play. And we'll also have a recording from CIEL later on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Max Dorman with the Fossil Fuel Atlas Project. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation today. I'm going to be giving you an overview of our portal, which is currently in its alpha phase of development. The Fossil Fuel Atlas will be an online toolkit for exploring, visualizing, and publicizing the threats of fossil fuel production, largely using map-based tools. And I will go more into the specific types of content that you can create with this portal in a minute, but for now I want to flag that this presentation was designed using one of the types of content that you can build with this portal. So fossil fuels are adversely impacting our oceans in many ways. Possibly the biggest way that they're impacting our oceans is by fueling 75% of the emissions causing climate change, which is already degrading our oceans now and will undoubtedly continue to do so as climate change unfolds and we continue to burn more fossil fuels. This map right here shows ocean acidification above pre-industrial levels. And you can see that already there's ocean acidification hotspots all over the world, unfolding as a result of our dependence on fossil fuels. So to avoid runaway climate change and consequent impacts on our oceans, all new fossil fuel production must stop. But unfortunately, current plans have fossil fuel production increasing in coming years. And you can see here that countries' plans and projections for fossil fuel production are well above what would be compatible with a 2-degree world, let alone a 1.5-degree world. So in addition to fueling climate change, fossil fuel production has many direct impacts on our oceans all along the supply chain. These impacts are often invisible until they unfold in real time. So that's what we're hoping to change with this portal. By providing a wide range of fossil fuel data, environmental data, and social data, along with mapping tools, we want to create a system for people to explore the potential threats of fossil fuels to ecosystems and individuals before those impacts unfold in the real world. There are 3 main types of tools featured in this portal. One of them is map stories, and that's what we've been looking at so far. The second is interactive maps, such as the one that I'm about to explore. And the third is data dashboards, which I'll go into in a second. So every type of content, the map stories and the data dashboards are built from interactive maps that you then build into these other tools. You can also use them as standalone maps as well. So this map right here is one of fossil fuel leases in and around the UK. And that is overlaid with seafloor biodiversity as shown by these green and transitioning all the way to bright yellow areas. So the brighter the color, the higher the seafloor biodiversity. And you can see immediately these areas down here and above in the north area where there's high seafloor biodiversity and also active fossil fuel exploration and production happening. So the last type of content that I'll go into is data dashboards. And these are tools that let you explore the underlying data in a dashboard format And what this map shows, I'm just going to zoom out for a second, is turtle nesting sites that are either within blocks that are licensed or unlicensed, or are outside of blocks, as per this little legend right here. And you'll notice that as I move around the map, this number in the top right updates based on the map view. And what it's telling us is how many nesting sites within licensed or unlicensed blocks are in the map view. So this gives you live information attached to the map as you explore, and you can start to see the immediate problems with fossil fuel production, the things that they pose, the issues that they pose for our ocean's ecosystems. We have a very large database of environmental, social, and fossil fuel data at your disposal in this portal. And for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on ocean data and the fossil fuel data. So this is the same turtle hatchling sites data set from the previous dashboard above. And also added in here is the distribution of turtle sightings all over the world, which is also kind of a proxy for migratory routes, as you can see. So we have many other data sets as well, including ecologically and biologically significant marine areas, marine protected areas, mangrove, kelp, and other coastal ecosystems, with the distribution of the kelp biome shown here, and thousands of aquatic species distributions. Shown here is the orange ruffy, which is a fish that's often caught commercially and locally for great economic value. This is an example of panning around and looking at the distribution range here for you. For the fossil fuel data highlights here, the core fossil fuel data for this platform is all supplied by Global Energy Monitor. Here you can see oil and gas pipelines of the world, where black lines are existing pipelines, red are proposed pipelines, and then orange are ones that are currently under construction. So there's just this global network here of pipelines that you can see. And then also available are LNG terminals, which are the import and export stops for fossil fuels through our oceans. Oil and gas lease blocks showing currently licensed and unlicensed lease areas, and much, much, much more, which I will not go into now, but it's all here and it's all available. So now I'm going to give an example of this portal in action, and it isn't necessarily specifically an ocean example, but this is the one that has been the most widely used and kind of got this project started, so I wanted to give a background on that. You'll see in the background here, there are these like different looking maps, and these are what we initially started producing before thinking that it would be good to not only produce static standalone content, but also make it possible for any individual or group to create these things for themselves and share them at scale. So as we're providing these materials for the East Africa crude oil pipeline campaigns contesting this pipeline, we received a lot of feedback that having just a visual to focus on that illustrates the problems. You know, a quote from somebody close to us that we worked with was, before it was just words, and then when you make it visually explicit, you start to immediately see what the problems are with these planned projects. So for example, here you can see protected areas that are very close to or intersected by the planned pipeline route, which would go from Uganda in the oil fields up here all the way down to the port of Tanga in Tanzania for export. This map shows rivers and Ramsar sites, so you can see that this pipeline would cross many, many, many rivers and like go all the way down to the ocean down here, while also threatening a bunch of Ramsar sites. And the reason that I mentioned this specifically in an oceans presentation is that the protected areas had a lot of legal teeth, it seemed, in these fights against the project. So just by making it visually explicit, it brought it to people's attention in ways that they weren't aware of it before. This rather bright map shows population density along the pipeline route. And this one shows forest cover in areas where the pipeline would go through forest cover. And I also wanted to give an example that's much more relevant to oceans. So this second one focuses on the Philippines. So here we can see ecologically and biologically significant marine areas, which are the blue circles and shapes. And you can see areas where license blocks, which are the ones that are darker filled in, can overlap with these ecologically and biologically significant marine areas. And this next one also adds in mangroves and coral reefs in cyan and red respectively. So you can see all of these areas where fossil fuel licenses overlap with these highly biodiverse ecosystems. And these are some more planned LNG terminals near the Verde Island Passage. This last map shows seafloor biodiversity around the Philippines, some of the highest in the world. And you can see areas where it overlaps with currently licensed blocks and unlicensed areas at risk. That's all for now. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you in the Q&A.
Hi, my name is Upasana Khatri, and I'm a senior attorney at CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law. For my presentation, I want to take a bit of a step back and situate the data tools developed by SkyTruth and SEI within the broader context of offshore oil and gas activity. It's impossible to talk about the condition of our oceans without addressing the threat posed by fossil fuels. The impact of oil and gas activity in and on oceans and coastlines is not limited to one location, but touch many geographies. They're inherently transboundary in nature and stem not only from accidental events, but also from routine operations and with impacts across the life cycle. But because offshore activity is often out of sight and out of mind, we don't always get the full picture of its ecological, marine, and climate impacts. This presentation aims to outline these impacts and to show how tools like Cerulean and the Fossil Fuel Atlas improve our understanding of the risks of offshore oil and gas activity, as well as the corresponding duties of states and corporate actors to refrain from activities that foreseeably threaten oceans, their marine biodiversity, and the climate and communities that depend on them. Offshore development has been expanding steadily for some time, but recently there is a trend toward production in increasingly deep, even ultra-deep waters. Also, one of the most significant growing threats to oceans is from the booming demand for fossil gas, and specifically from increased LNG, or liquefied natural gas, production and use. While the fossil gas that's liquefied for LNG may come from offshore or onshore sites, LNG uses the ocean as a conduit or a highway, and LNG infrastructure dots coastlines around the world. So the industry necessarily has significant impacts on oceans that must be confronted. As this map shows, LNG buildout is widespread and affecting coastal areas and marine ecosystems in virtually every continent. On top of the impacts posed by import and export terminals, which are shown by the dots on this map, increased ocean traffic due to LNG carriers presents its own tolls on the climate and marine ecosystems. As oil and gas activity moves further offshore and into tracts of oceans where the industry has not previously been, it poses a growing threat to marine conservation and biodiversity. This graph shows how over the last century, especially in recent decades, the number of offshore operations has increased significantly. And as operations move to deeper waters, they're impacting a growing number of species. In fact, thanks to the SEI's Fossil Fuel Atlas, you can see here just how much overlap there is between ecologically or biologically significant marine areas, which is represented in blue, and oil and gas blocks and production sites, which are indicated by the red. We're also seeing offshore build-out increasingly impacting fisherfolk communities. As seen in this map, the darkest blue areas, which indicate the highest concentrations of small-scale fisheries, are also places where there are some of the greatest number of offshore oil and gas concessions. And there are many ways in which oil and gas activity can harm fisheries, such as by causing reduced or contaminated fish catch and by displacing locals from traditional fishing grounds. So why is this build out such a great concern? Well, because oil and gas activity has adverse impacts across all of its phases. And while I don't have time to detail all the many environmental risks, a key point I want to leave with you today is that it's not just the accidental, but also the routine impacts of oil and gas activity that threaten oceans. And these impacts occur throughout the life cycle, from exploration to drilling, transport, decommissioning, and to the inevitable burning and consumption of the fossil fuels produced. Even the process of surveying oceans to locate oil and gas reserves can have very harmful implications for marine life. The use of seismic surveys causes significant noise pollution that can induce serious physiological stress and provoke life-threatening behavioral responses in everything from shellfish to whales. These impacts have been the basis of legal challenges to new offshore oil and gas exploration in places like South Africa and Argentina, among others. Offshore drilling is moving increasingly to deeper and more remote waters where ocean conditions are more volatile, as well as to regions that lack the resources and infrastructure to respond to disasters. That means that everything is magnified in terms of risks: the possibility of well blowouts, the danger and difficulty of stopping a resulting spill, and the risks that a spill poses to surrounding life. In fact, research shows that for every 100 feet deeper a well is drilled, the likelihood of a spill increases by over 8%. But it's not just the very real risk of blowouts and spills we need to worry about when it comes to drilling. The operational and routine environmental impacts of production are equally, if not more, concerning than accidental events. This includes the over 700 million tons of toxic wastewater that offshore platforms dump into the ocean every year. And it also includes the climate footprint. The ocean's role in the global climate system is jeopardized by continued fossil fuel emissions, which are driving acidification and warming waters, among many other impacts. And offshore projects are amplifying this threat. The climate impacts during offshore production alone are significant. Methane leakages seem to be greater in offshore sites, as documented by a recent Carbon Mapper report. And as you may know, methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas, capable of trapping 86 times more heat than the same amount of CO2 over a 20-year period. Also, gas flaring, the on-site burning of excess gas, continues to occur around the world but is systematically unreported, as documented by a recent BBC investigation. But thanks to new technologies like cerulean, we're able to get a much better picture of the truly enormous climate impacts of offshore activity. There are many environmental hazards associated with the transfer of oil and gas by sea, including vessel and pipeline-related oil spills, the release of toxic bilge water by ships, and, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions. And many of these risks aren't unique or exclusive to the transfer of oil and gas produced offshore, but are applicable to the general movement of fossil fuels across oceans and to global markets. In essence, oceans have become the conduit for the dirty trade in fossil fuels, including LNG. As noted, the massive build-out of LNG involves a tremendous amount of coastal infrastructure development, as well as increased vessel traffic. From a climate perspective, LNG is anything but clean. On top of significant upstream greenhouse gas emissions from methane leaks and venting during production and processing, it's incredibly energy intensive to compress gas to a liquid state, keep it cool during transport, and then regasify it at import sites. And all of these processes, from the coastal liquefaction and gasification plants to the vessels themselves, pose threats to the oceans, coastal and marine ecosystems, and dependent communities. Even when offshore operations end, the legacy of harm doesn't. Due to high costs coupled with the general lack of oversight, many operators will simply abandon rigs and wells without proper decommissioning and cleanup. This abandoned infrastructure can then continue to leak toxic contaminants and planet-warming gases for many decades. For example, research shows that 1/3 of abandoned wells in the North Sea are currently releasing between 3,000 and 17,000 tons of methane every year. There are also as many as 27,000 abandoned wells in the Gulf of Mexico that are likely also spewing methane and other contaminants. Even when carried out per industry standards, decommissioning activities can disturb and pollute ecosystems. And even plugged wells can fail due to weathering and ocean conditions. There are therefore many environmental risks during decommissioning as well as throughout the offshore life cycle that are simply inevitable, even under best-case industry scenarios. As you can see from this table, there are existing international and regional laws and frameworks to protect the marine environment, to prevent accidental pollution and discharge, and to ensure that polluters pay. And these can and should be applied to current and proposed offshore oil and gas activities in order to prevent further foreseeable harm. This legal network is reflective of states and international bodies' recognition that conduct in and on oceans is inherently transboundary and international in impact. But at the same time, these frameworks currently address different phases of the offshore oil and gas life cycle in a very piecemeal, uneven, and incomplete way. Given the massive increase in oil and gas activity in and on oceans that we're seeing, as well as the increasing confluence of threats facing oceans, from toxic pollution to climate change, there is an urgent need to confront and fill these legal and regulatory gaps. To conclude, confronting oil and gas activity is central to any conversation about marine protection and the health of our oceans. And tools like Cerulean and the Fossil Fuel Atlas that help visualize the risks and impacts of oil and gas are critical to strengthening ocean governance and holding polluters to account. Thank you.